"You won't see us again." Those 6 words ended a family and started a war no one saw coming. It happened in the lobby of a quiet senior facility just outside Columbus, Ohio. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. Nora, 68, stood beside a half-packed suitcase, still wearing the coat she'd ironed that morning. Her son Ken was signing papers without reading them. His wife, Emily, crossed her arms, eyes fixed on her phone until it was time to deliver the sentence that would cut her mother-in-law out of their lives. "This will be your new home," she said. "We won't be visiting. Not ever." For a few seconds, Nora thought she'd misheard. The sound of a printer, the shuffle of nurses, the buzz of fluorescent lights, everything blurred into a dull hum. Ken adjusted his tie like he couldn't wait to leave. Emily glanced toward the parking lot, and Nora, who had spent 40 years keeping everyone else's world in order, realized hers had quietly ended. But she didn't cry. Not one tear. Something deeper than anger began to form a slow, cold clarity that felt almost like peace. She nodded once. "I understand," she said, her voice calm, practiced, the way she'd sounded in every office meeting she'd ever survived. To anyone watching, it looked like surrender. But deep down, she was taking inventory of everything she had given and everything they were about to lose. Her mind drifted, not backward in nostalgia, but in accounting. The years of waking at 5, packing lunches, commuting through snow to a job that barely paid enough. The extra shifts to cover Ken's textbooks. The night she sold her wedding ring to help with his first down payment. Every decision had been made for someone else's comfort, never her own. That was what love looked like in her generation's sacrifice without complaint. Now, staring at her son's detached face, she wondered when exactly love had turned into obligation. When Ken finished signing, he gave her a quick nod. "They'll take good care of you here," he said, as if she were a pet being dropped off at a kennel. Emily smiled politely. "You'll have your own space, your meals, medical support. It's for the best." Nora studied her daughter-in-law's face, pretty, efficient, hollow, and felt nothing but an odd sense of release. She wanted to ask one question. "At what point did you both decide I stopped being human?" But she didn't. Some truths didn't deserve the mercy of being spoken. As they walked away, the automatic doors opened with a hiss and closed again, leaving behind a silence so complete it almost rang. Nora stayed where she was, holding the strap of her suitcase. Outside, the sky was gray and still. She whispered, almost to herself, "You'll learn what happens when you underestimate someone who has nothing left to lose." Later that evening, in the small beige room assigned to her, she unpacked deliberately. Every folded blouse, every framed photo of Ken and the grandchildren felt like evidence from another life. She placed them neatly on the dresser, not as memories, but as proof that she had once existed in their world. When the last item was in place, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her hands. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from energy, from something waking up inside her. For the first time in decades, there were no alarms to set, no dinners to plan, no one expecting her to explain herself. The emptiness of the room wasn't loneliness, it was potential. Freedom had come dressed as exile. She reached for the bedside lamp and switched it on. The light flickered, then steadied. In its glow, her reflection appeared faintly in the window, a woman she almost didn't recognize. The lines around her eyes weren't from age. They were from years of being polite. Now, she thought, that woman could finally stop apologizing for surviving. She lay back and listened to the hum of the heater. The night pressed in, still and warm. Tomorrow, she would begin to remember who she was before she became useful. But tonight, she simply breathed and let one final thought settle like dust on a clean floor. They believed they'd left her behind. In truth, they had just set her free. Freedom always sounds beautiful until you're staring at it with nowhere to go. The next morning, Nora sat at the edge of her narrow bed, staring at a styrofoam cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The walls around her were a pale, bureaucratic beige, the kind of color that promised nothing and delivered exactly that. She wasn't crying. She didn't feel like crying. Mostly, she felt suspended. Like her life had been unplugged from the wall, and the current was still draining out. Somewhere down the hall, a television played a morning show too loudly. A nurse laughed. Someone's lunch tray rattled past, and in that ordinary noise, Nora felt invisible, not unwanted, erased. She glanced at the family photos she had placed neatly on the dresser. The smiles looked rehearsed now, almost like ads for a life that had never existed. There was Ken at his college graduation, beaming in his cap and gown. The night before that ceremony, she'd stayed up till 2 a.m., ironing his shirt and sewing a loose button on his sleeve. He never noticed. He just said, "Thanks, Mom," the way people say thanks to a cashier. Her mind drifted to the long road that had brought her here. She had been 24 when her husband, a construction foreman, died in an accident. One phone call, one silence after the word sorry, and suddenly she was a widow with a toddler and a mortgage. She never remarried. There wasn't time. Between double shifts at the insurance office and side jobs doing data entry, she built a life out of exhaustion and hope. Ken had been her reason, her engine. Every sacrifice was proof that her struggle had meaning. But somewhere along the line, that meaning had quietly expired. She remembered the first time Emily visited their small apartment. Her perfect hair, her careful compliments, her soft disdain for the old furniture. "You've done so much," Emily had said sweetly. "We'll take care of you someday." At the time, Nora believed her. That someday had arrived, just not in the way she imagined. She picked up her phone, scrolling through old text messages from Ken, birthday reminders, grocery lists, polite updates that could have come from a stranger. The last one was months ago. "Don't wait up." Late meeting. There was no "love you." There hadn't been for years. The truth pressed against her chest, like a hand she couldn't push away. Somewhere between raising her son and becoming his live-in babysitter, she had disappeared. What was left was a woman who cooked, cleaned, and stayed quiet, and when she stopped being useful, she became a burden. The thought should have broken her. Instead, it steadied her, because it meant she finally saw the truth clearly, painfully, completely. She stood up, walked to the window, and watched the early sunlight slide across the parking lot. Cars came and went. People were visiting parents, bringing flowers, promising to call more often. She smiled faintly at the irony. "They all think they're different," she whispered, "until they're not." At 9:30, a nurse named Clara knocked softly and poked her head in. "Mrs. Baker, you settling in okay?" "Yes," Nora said. "It's fine." Clara smiled. "If you need anything, just press the button on the wall. Breakfast till 10. When the door closed, Nora exhaled. Even here, people used that same practiced kindness, the one that meant nothing. She didn't blame them. The world wasn't cruel, it was indifferent. And indifference could be more lethal than hate. She sat back down on the bed and folded her hands. 40 years of labor, love, and loyalty, and this was her retirement gift. But what her son and daughter-in-law didn't know, couldn't possibly imagine, was that she had never been the kind of woman who stayed broken. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Somewhere deep inside, a different kind of plan was taking shape, slow, deliberate, patient. Not revenge exactly, but something colder, cleaner. She reached into her purse and pulled out an old black notebook, the one she used to track household bills and grocery lists. On the first blank page, she wrote 3 words in tidy cursive: "No more waiting." The heater hummed again. A clock ticked softly above her head. Outside, the morning light shifted from gray to gold. And with that quiet, Nora Baker, mother, widow, invisible woman, decided that the rest of her life would no longer belong to anyone else. "Tomorrow," she told herself, "the world will remember my name." The next day, Nora woke before dawn out of habit more than necessity. For 40 years, her mornings had belonged to someone else. Packing lunches, ironing shirts, checking homework, brewing coffee she never had time to drink. Now, the silence felt almost too large, like a house after a storm. She sat there in the dark, the faint hum of the heater, her only companion, realizing for the first time that no one needed her anymore, and maybe that wasn't entirely a tragedy. She walked to the small sink, splashed water on her face, and looked at her reflection. The woman staring back at her wasn't soft anymore. She was alert, awake. The kind of calm that comes after you've survived a fire and realized you're still standing. She smoothed her hair, straightened her sweater, and whispered to herself, "Let's start." Down in the cafeteria, the scent of scrambled eggs and burnt toast filled the air. The residents spoke softly, trading stories about children who rarely called. Every face in that room carried some version of her own pain, the quiet exile of being forgotten. Nora nodded politely to a few of them, took her tray, and sat near the window. It wasn't sadness she felt. It was a strange clarity, like she could finally see the invisible math of life, how the people who give everything are often the ones left with nothing. For decades, she had told herself that love was repayment enough, that raising a son who was kind, successful, and stable meant her life had value. But Ken's last words at the facility, "It'll be better for everyone," proved how easily gratitude turns into entitlement. She remembered the week everything had started to change. It was subtle at first. Emily began correcting her cooking. The kids preferred Mom's meals. Ken said the house felt tense when she was around. Then came the suggestion that she contribute to expenses. $13,000 a month for a home she had helped them buy. When she objected, Emily smiled and said, "You're lucky we're giving you a good rate." Nora paid. She told herself it was temporary, but it wasn't. It was the beginning of her eviction, a slow erasure dressed up as fairness. The final blow came when Emily began dropping hints at dinner about memory issues. Forgetting the salt, repeating a story, misplacing keys all became evidence of decline. Ken believed it, or maybe he wanted to. It made everything easier. Easier to feel righteous when you betray someone who needs care. That memory still stung, but not for the reason she thought. It wasn't betrayal that hurt, it was realization. She had raised a son who valued convenience over loyalty, and maybe that was her fault. She had taught him that love means service, that mothers don't quit, that giving without limits makes you good. She pushed her tray away, appetite gone. Across the room, a television played a commercial about retirement freedom couples laughing on beaches, silver hair glowing in the sunday. She almost laughed. Freedom, she thought, costs more than most people can afford. After breakfast, she walked outside into the cold November air. The sky was a flat white, the kind that hides the Sunday. The parking lot was full of cars, families visiting, hugging, promising to come back soon. She watched a young woman help her father into a wheelchair and saw tenderness in their eyes. For a brief second, envy pricked her chest, but it faded quickly. That kind of love, she realized, could vanish overnight. She knew she'd lived it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from the facility's administrator. Reminder meeting with our financial office tomorrow at 10 a.m. to finalize paperwork. She typed a polite thank you and stared at the screen for a long time. If this was her new life, then it would be hers completely. She was done playing the part of the grateful dependent. Somewhere deep inside, another voice, one she hadn't heard since she was young, whispered, "You still have power." Back in her room, she sat at the small wooden desk and opened her purse. Inside was a business card, worn at the edges, Sullivan and Hart Financial Group, her father's old brokers. She had kept it tucked away for decades, more out of sentiment than intent. Her father had told her once, "Don't ever let anyone else hold your security." At the time, she hadn't understood. Now, she did. She opened her notebook again, where she'd written "no more waiting." Underneath it, she added another line. "Tomorrow, everything changes." She picked up her phone, opened her contacts, and scrolled through names she hadn't seen in years, old colleagues, a friend from accounting, and finally, a number labeled Mr. Ray, Legal. She hesitated for a moment, then pressed call. "Hello?" A warm, startled voice answered. "Mr. Ray? It's Nora Baker." There was a pause, then recognition. "Nora, my God, it's been years. How are you?" She smiled faintly. "I'm ready to finish some business." When the call ended, Nora sat back in her chair, her heartbeat steady and calm. For the first time in her life, she wasn't reacting to what others did, she was setting the next move. The rest of the day passed quietly. Lunch, a walk, the polite chatter of people surviving. But under that calm routine, the machinery of something new had begun to turn. By evening, she stood again by the window, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The reflection in the glass was no longer the same woman who arrived yesterday. The fear was gone. The hesitation, too. Whatever came next, she would not be a victim of kindness again. Tomorrow, she thought, they'll remember who they left behind. The next morning came with the kind of sharp, silver light that only November knows. Nora was awake before sunrise, already dressed, already waiting. She ate breakfast quickly, signed out at the front desk, and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to sting, but it felt clean, like something new beginning. She hadn't told anyone at the facility where she was going. She didn't owe anyone explanations anymore. Her first stop was a brick building downtown, the kind with an old brass plaque that read Sullivan and Hart Financial Group. The receptionist blinked when she gave her name. "Of course, Miss Baker. One moment, please." Within minutes, she was led to a private office where a younger man in a charcoal suit stood to greet her. "Mrs. Baker," he said, "we've been expecting you." It had been more than 30 years since she'd last set foot in that office. The last time, her father had been alive, an original investor in the very company where her son now worked. Before his death, he'd left her a quiet inheritance, a portfolio she had never touched, a secret she had never mentioned. Her father's advice echoed in her head now, as if whispered across time. "This is your shield, Nora. Only use it when you must." She sat down, her movements calm and deliberate. "I'm ready to sell," she said. The broker looked surprised. "All of it? Every share?" He hesitated. "That's nearly 30% of the company's voting stock." "Are you sure?" She smiled faintly. "Completely. For decades, that stock had sat dormant, compounding value in silence, while she cooked and cleaned and raised a son who believed she owned nothing. Now, that silence would speak. The buyer had already been arranged, a large investment fund that had been circling the company for months. They'd pay quickly, they'd pay well, and when the ink dried, her son's world would look very different. By 10:30, the paperwork was signed. The broker slid the final document across the desk. "You understand, this will shift control of the company. There'll be consequences." Nora's pen didn't waver. "Consequences," she said quietly, "are how people learn." Outside, she took a deep breath of cold air, the city noise rushing around her. She didn't feel giddy or triumphant. What she felt was stillness, the kind that comes after a long-held weight finally leaves your hands. Her next appointment was 2 blocks away, at the office of a lawyer she'd known since her working days. He was older now, silver-haired, but still kind. "Nora Baker," he said warmly. "It's been ages." She returned the smile. "I need to update my will." They talked for nearly an hour. She explained exactly what she wanted: all remaining assets, property, and savings to be donated to community shelters and educational funds for single mothers. Not a penny to her son or his wife. The lawyer hesitated only once. "You're sure you don't want to leave them something? A token, perhaps?" She shook her head. "I've already given them enough for a lifetime." After signing the documents, she left the office lighter than she'd felt in years. There was one last stop: the bank. The teller recognized her name immediately. Joint accounts, retirement funds, property titles, all of it neatly listed. Nora closed every shared account, transferred her savings into a new one, and opened a small deposit for the care home's expenses. By noon, it was done. 40 years of invisible labor, finally reclaimed in a few quiet hours. She stopped for lunch at a small diner near the courthouse. The waitress, barely 20, poured her coffee and smiled. "You doing okay today, ma'am?" Nora smiled back genuinely. "Better than ever." She ate slowly, savoring the taste of freedom that came with each bite. Around her, people hurried through their lunch breaks, checking phones, rushing back to lives that would keep them spinning. She had no such obligations anymore. Her world had stopped revolving around anyone else, and that was its own kind of miracle. As she paid her bill, she pulled a folded paper from her purse and read over the confirmation numbers: sale finalized, funds transferred, ownership changed. She imagined Ken at his desk tomorrow morning when the news broke. The family company sold, control gone, his security evaporating faster than he could process it. It wasn't revenge, it was math. Cause and effect. He had built his life on her silence. Now, her silence was gone. When she returned to the facility later that afternoon, the receptionist greeted her with the same polite tone as always. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Baker. Everything okay?" "Everything," Nora said, "is finally fine." That night, in her room, she wrote one last note on the same black notebook that had started it all. Freedom earned. Then she closed it gently and set it on the nightstand. She looked out the window, the city lights flickering like distant stars, and whispered to the dark, "Tomorrow, they'll finally understand what it costs to discard the wrong woman." The following morning, at 8:45 sharp, the glass conference room at Meriton Industries was already packed. Phones buzzed, ties were loosened, whispers filled the air. Something was wrong. Ken rushed in, still buttoning his jacket, his face pale. He had barely made it through the traffic when his assistant called, voice trembling. "There's been an emergency board meeting. They said it's about the shareholders." Now he stood among men who suddenly refused to meet his eyes. At the head of the table, the CEO adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and said the words that would dismantle everything. "Yesterday afternoon, our primary stakeholder, Mrs. Nora Baker, sold her entire 30% equity position to a private investment group." For a moment, no one moved. Ken blinked. The name echoed in his skull, Nora Baker. His mother's name. But it couldn't be her. She was a retired secretary, not an investor. His mother didn't even understand the stock market. He forced out a laugh. There must be a mistake. The CEO's face didn't change. "No mistake. The records trace back to an original founder, Richard Sullivan. Your mother was his only heir. She's held that stake since 1987. Ken's mouth went dry. "That's impossible." "She completed the sale yesterday morning," the CEO continued. "Effective immediately. Meriton's controlling interest now belongs to Crestline Capital Group." The room went silent. Everyone knew what that meant. Layoffs, restructuring, new management jobs gone. The company Ken had devoted 20 years to was no longer his future. It wasn't even his employer. The CEO's tone softened, but only slightly. "I'm sorry, Ken. You might want to call her." Ken didn't answer. He couldn't. The ground beneath him had shifted too fast. His phone vibrated in his pocket, but he didn't look. He was already halfway out the door, heading toward the elevator, his mind blank. By the time he reached the parking lot, a second call came in. This time it was Emily. Her voice was frantic. "Ken, you need to come home right now." "What happened?" "It's the house. Just get here, now." He drove like a man possessed, every red light a blur. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. His heart pounded not just with fear but humiliation. How could his mother have done this? How could she have hidden something so massive from him? When he pulled into the driveway, Emily was standing at the door holding a letter. Her face was pale, her hair unkempt, her voice breaking. "You need to see this." Ken tore open the envelope. Inside was an official-looking notice stamped with a legal seal. Notice of termination of tenancy. He read it twice, not understanding. Then Emily whispered, "The deed's in her name, Ken. The house, the land, everything. She never transferred it. We've been living here for free." His eyes scanned the paper again, the words swimming. They had 30 days to vacate. 30 days before the house was no longer theirs. "She can't do this," he muttered, voice shaking. Emily shot back. "She can. It's legal." "I called the county office." He sat down heavily on the stairs, hands gripping his hair. "But why now?" Emily stared at him, anger and fear mixing in her voice. "Why do you think? You threw her away. You made her feel like nothing." Her words hit harder than he expected because they were true. He'd told himself he was being practical, not cruel. That moving her to the home was for her comfort, not his convenience. But now, staring at the letter, the story he'd built for himself was collapsing. He felt his phone buzz again. Another call, unknown number. He ignored it. He didn't want to hear her voice. He didn't know what he'd say if he did. Emily walked into the living room and sat on the couch, staring at the family photos still hanging on the wall, their wedding, the kids' birthdays, Christmas mornings. Every memory suddenly looked borrowed. "What are we going to tell the kids?" she whispered. Ken didn't answer. He didn't have one. The next morning, his inbox flooded with messages from colleagues. Rumors about mass layoffs, management purges, possible closures. One email confirmed his worst fear. He was out. Effective immediately. In less than 24 hours, everything he had built, his career, his home, his image of control, had disintegrated. He finally dialed his mother's number. Straight to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. A third time. Still nothing. His chest felt tight. "We're going to the facility," he said to Emily. They drove in silence. The road blurred under gray skies. When they reached the building, Ken rushed to the front desk. "We're here to see Nora Baker. It's urgent." The receptionist smiled gently, unaware of the storm behind him. "Of course. She's in the common room. Follow me." As they walked down the hallway, the air grew heavy. Every step echoed like judgment. When the door opened, there she was sitting near the window, reading a newspaper, a faint smile on her face. She looked calm, rested, almost radiant. Ken froze at the sight. "Mom," he said quietly, then louder. "Mom, what did you do?" She folded the newspaper neatly, looked up and said, "I took back what was mine." Emily stepped forward. "You sold the company, evicted us from the house, emptied the account, how could you?" Nora tilted her head, studying them as though they were strangers at a party she hadn't invited. "You told me we weren't family. I believed you." Ken's breath caught. "We didn't mean it." "Yes, you did," she said softly. "And that's what makes this fair." She leaned back in her chair, calm as stone, while her son's world fell apart in front of her. For a long time, no one spoke. The air in that small visiting room felt charged, like static before a storm. Ken stood frozen, his hands shaking at his sides. Emily tried to steady her voice, but anger kept bleeding through. "You've gone too far, Nora. You can't just erase us." Nora looked at her, expression serene. "Erase you? You did that yourselves." She placed the folded newspaper on the table and met Emily's gaze. "You called me a burden. You moved me here without asking. You told me I was never to visit or call again. I accepted your decision. Now I've simply made mine." Emily opened her mouth, then closed it again. The words wouldn't come. Ken finally found his voice. "Mom, please. We were wrong. I shouldn't have." Nora interrupted, her tone soft but steady. "No, Ken. Don't do that. Don't rewrite what happened just because the outcome scares you. You made choices. I made mine. That's all this is." Her calmness made it worse. Ken wanted her to yell, to cry, to act like the mother who used to protect him from everything. But she didn't. She just sat there, unmovable. He took a step closer. "We've lost everything. My job, the house, everything. We're broke, Mom." Nora tilted her head slightly. "Then you'll rebuild. Like I did. Like millions of people do. You're still young enough to start over." Her words weren't cruel. They were precise, like a surgeon's cut, not meant to wound, but to expose what lay beneath. Emily's composure cracked. "Do you even care? We're your family." Nora's eyes flickered. "Family," she repeated, tasting the word as if testing its weight. "Family doesn't discard one of its own like trash. You didn't want a mother, Emily. You wanted a live-in maid who paid rent." Emily's face flushed. "That's not fair." "Fair," Nora said quietly, "is a word people use when they're losing." Ken's voice broke. "Mom, please, just help us fix this. We can start over. You don't have to forgive us, but don't do this." Nora leaned forward, her voice calm but unshakable. "Ken, you've been raised to believe that I'll always rescue you, that no matter what you do, your mother will clean up the mess. But I'm not your safety net anymore. You taught me that when you left me here." He stared at her, speechless. The truth of it was undeniable. She continued almost gently now. "You told me I was a burden, that you'd be happier without me. You said those words, Ken. So I gave you what you asked for, a life without me." Emily folded her arms, her voice rising again. "You're doing this to punish us." "No," Nora said, shaking her head. "I'm doing this to protect myself. There's a difference." The nurse at the door shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Nora nodded politely to her before turning back to the couple in front of her. "I don't hate you," she said. "I don't even wish you harm. But you both needed to learn something I should have taught you years ago. Kindness is not weakness. Silence is not surrender." She stood up slowly. The movement was deliberate, final. "You should go now. I think we've said everything worth saying." Ken looked at her helplessly. "Please, Mom, just tell me what to do." She paused, hand on the back of the chair. "Learn to take responsibility. Start there." Emily grabbed his arm, whispering sharply, "Ken, let's go." As they turned to leave, Nora added quietly, "You have 30 days to vacate the house. I'll have someone collect the keys." Emily spun around. "You're really doing this?" Nora met her eyes. "You said we weren't family. I'm simply honoring that." Emily's jaw clenched, her voice trembling. "You'll regret this." Nora smiled faintly. "No, for the first time I won't." They left without another word. The door shut behind them with a soft click, and the room felt suddenly lighter. Nora exhaled, the breath long and steady. Her hands trembled just slightly, not from guilt, but release. For decades, she had been the woman who apologized for existing. Now, she finally understood the power of no. She sat back down, watching the sunlight spill across the floor. It was almost noon. Somewhere, her son was realizing that the woman he thought he could control had never truly belonged to him. For the first time in years, she felt an unfamiliar sensation rising in her chest. It wasn't joy, not exactly. It was peace, the kind that comes when you stop asking to be understood. Tomorrow, she thought, I'll start a new chapter, not as someone's mother, not as someone's burden, just as me. 3 months passed, winter melted into spring, and with it, the last fragments of the life Nora had once lived. By the time the magnolias bloomed along the river, she had already left the facility and moved into a small but elegant apartment downtown, the kind with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city lights she used to watch from a bus stop on her way home from work. She paid for it herself, in full, without hesitation. The first thing she noticed after moving in was the silence, not the kind that hurt, but the kind that invited thought. She no longer woke up to other people's schedules. No alarms, no demands, no guilt. Her time was finally her own. The funds from the stock sale had been divided carefully, a portion invested for steady income, another earmarked for community programs that helped women like her caregivers, widows, the forgotten. She had met with financial planners, attorneys, and nonprofits. Every detail was in place. Her life, for the first time, was fully hers. Each morning, she walked to a cafe 2 blocks away, where the barista now knew her name. She would read the paper, sip her coffee slowly, and watch people rushing past the window, people who looked the way she once did, always late, always tired, always giving more than they received. Sometimes she wanted to tell them, "It's okay to stop. The world won't fall apart if you rest," but she knew most wouldn't believe her until it was too late. In the afternoons, she took painting classes at a community art studio. Oil on canvas, still lifes, sometimes landscapes. Her teacher, a woman in her 40s with streaks of green in her hair, once told her, "You paint like someone who's seen everything and decided not to flinch." Nora smiled at that. It felt accurate. The other students were mostly retirees, like her women who had lived for others too long and were now learning how to take up space again. They laughed, shared stories, and sometimes stayed after class just to talk. It wasn't friendship in the way she used to understand it. It was solidarity, built on shared quiet and mutual respect. One evening after class, they gathered at a nearby wine bar. The conversation turned to regret the children who didn't call, the husbands who hadn't stayed, the dreams postponed until there was no time left to chase them. When it was Nora's turn to speak, she simply said, "I stopped apologizing." The table went silent, then one of them nodded. "Good," another woman said softly. "It's about time someone did." That night, back in her apartment, Nora opened the balcony doors. The air was warm and smelled faintly of rain. She poured herself a glass of wine and leaned on the railing, looking out at the skyline. Somewhere below, car horns and laughter echoed up the street, but she wasn't lonely. The loneliness had burned itself out months ago, leaving something steadier in its place: independence. She thought about Ken sometimes, but not with bitterness. The last she'd heard, the company had gone through a full restructuring, and he'd been laid off. Emily had filed for divorce. It was all public record. She hadn't gone looking. Life had simply delivered the updates to her doorstep, as if confirming that her story had moved on and theirs had stayed behind. She hoped, in a strange way, that they were learning something from it, that maybe losing everything had forced them to see the people they'd taken for granted. But she didn't dwell on it. Their journey wasn't hers to fix anymore. As she stood there watching the sunset, she caught her reflection in the glass door, a woman older, wiser, unbroken. The wrinkles that once embarrassed her now felt like medals. Every line told a story of endurance, of survival, of finally choosing herself. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from her art teacher. "Lunch tomorrow? There's a new gallery downtown." She smiled and typed back, "Wouldn't miss it." She took another sip of wine, letting the city hum around her. The years of servitude, the guilt, the exhaustion, they all seemed like another life. Now she belonged to no one. And for the first time, that didn't mean she was alone, it meant she was free. She whispered into the fading light, almost as if speaking to her past self, "You did it. You got out." Then she closed the balcony door, turned off the lights, and let the quiet fill the room like peace itself. It was early summer when Ken showed up again. 3 months had passed since their last confrontation, and in that time, Nora had managed to forget what his voice even sounded like. So when the concierge called her apartment and said, "Mrs. Baker, there's a gentleman downstairs asking to see you. Says he's your son," she almost said no. Almost. But curiosity, or maybe closure, made her answer, "Send him up." When the elevator doors opened, Ken stepped out slowly. He looked smaller somehow. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a wrinkled shirt and hollow eyes. He'd lost weight, maybe hope too. There was a pause before either of them spoke. "Mom," he began, voice cracking. "You look good," she gestured to the couch. "You look tired." He gave a short laugh. "Yeah, that's one word for it." He sat down, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I didn't know where else to go." Nora poured 2 glasses of water and placed one in front of him. "Why are you here, Ken?" He hesitated. "I got laid off. The new investors cut the entire division, and Emily, she left, took the kids back to her mother's." His voice faltered. "I can't blame her. I failed them." Nora stayed quiet. He kept talking, the words tumbling out like stones he'd carried too long. "I sold the car, the furniture, everything. I'm trying to find work, but nobody's hiring at my age. He stopped, shaking his head. "I thought maybe we could start over. Maybe I could help you with things here. I could." "Stop." Her voice was gentle but firm. "You're not here to help me. You're here because you need help." He looked up sharply. "That's not true." "Yes, it is," she said. "And that's fine, but don't pretend this is about reconciliation." He stared at her, and for the first time in his life, he saw someone he didn't recognize. His mother wasn't pleading, or soft, or waiting for his approval. She was steady, self-contained, untouchable. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm sorry." "I believe you," she said, "but apology and accountability are not the same thing. You're sorry for the consequences, not for the choices." He swallowed hard. "I didn't know you'd been holding all that stock. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wasn't yours," she said simply. "I wanted you to learn how to build a life on your own merit, not on my protection." He rubbed his face. "I wish you'd trusted me." She looked at him for a long moment. "No, Ken, I wish you'd respected me. There's a difference." The silence stretched between them, heavy but honest. Finally, she stood and walked to the window. The city shimmered outside, sunlight bouncing off glass towers. "You're not the first man to lose everything," she said. "But maybe this time you'll learn what everything really is." Ken turned toward her, eyes wet. "I don't even know where to start." She faced him fully now, calm and steady. "Start by working. Any job, stop chasing status, start building character. Humility is not a punishment, it's a reset." He nodded slowly, as if hearing a language he'd never known existed. "And you? Are you happy?" The question caught her off guard, but she answered truthfully. "Yes, I am. Happier than I've ever been." Something in her tone made him look away. Maybe shame, maybe envy. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. She smiled, not the motherly smile of comfort, but the restrained, peaceful kind you give when you've already made peace with the past. "You're proud of me now that I stopped serving you. That's a start." He looked up, eyes full of regret. "Can we ever—" "No," she interrupted gently. "We can't go back, but you can move forward." Ken nodded, defeated but strangely lighter, as if hearing the truth was better than pretending. He stood up, glancing around her apartment, the canvases, the books, the light spilling across the hardwood floor. It wasn't the home he remembered. It was hers alone. "Take care of yourself," he said finally. "I always do," she replied. At the door he hesitated, then looked back one last time. "You really mean it, don't you? You don't need us anymore." Nora's voice was soft, almost kind. "I never needed you, Ken. I chose you. That's what makes love real choice. But choice goes both ways." He nodded once, eyes glistening, and left. When the door closed, she stood in the silence for a moment. The echo of his footsteps faded down the hall. There was no anger in her chest anymore, only a quiet clarity. She turned back toward the window, where the late afternoon sun painted the sky in gold. Somewhere below, the city pulsed with life, messy, unpredictable, unstoppable. She raised her glass of water in a small toast to no one in particular. "To endings," she murmured, "and to the freedom that comes after." Then she smiled not out of victory, but peace, and returned to her canvas, where a new painting waited, half-finished but full of light. Weeks passed after Ken's visit, and the silence he left behind never felt heavy. Nora didn't replay the conversation, didn't wonder if she'd been too harsh. Some things, once spoken, simply settled into truth. She knew this was one of them. Her days had found a quiet rhythm now, mornings spent painting, afternoons walking through the city, evenings reading by the window. The noise of the world, deadlines, arguments, guilt, no longer reached her. She had built a small, deliberate life, and every hour belonged entirely to her. But peace, she'd learned, doesn't erase memory, it just makes space for it. One night, as rain tapped gently against the glass, she found herself thinking about the younger version of herself, the woman who used to rush home with grocery bags cutting into her hands, rehearsing the words, "It's fine, I'll handle it." She thought about all the times she'd been invisible on purpose, because invisibility felt safer than confrontation. That woman was gone now, but Nora still owed her something: acknowledgement. She walked to her desk, opened the same black notebook that had started everything, and began to write. "To the woman I used to be, you did your best with what you had. You gave too much because you believed love would return in equal measure. It didn't. But that doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human. You thought kindness was weakness, and now you know better. You thought staying quiet was peace, and now you know silence is its own kind of death. You thought love meant sacrifice, but it really means balance. Thank you for surviving long enough for me to learn all that." She closed the notebook and exhaled, feeling the strange relief that only honesty can bring. The next morning, she took a taxi to a community shelter, the first one she had funded through her trust. A social worker named Angela greeted her at the door, bright-eyed and tired in the same way Nora used to be. They toured the place together. Small rooms, fresh paint, bunk beds neatly made, a kitchen that smelled of coffee and toast. "This place was dying before your donation," Angela said. "Now we have new beds, a second-floor study room, a childcare program. You probably saved it." Nora smiled faintly. "I didn't save it. I just returned something that was never truly mine." Angela looked at her, puzzled, but didn't press. They walked past a group of women cooking lunch in the communal kitchen, a mother humming softly while her daughter colored on the counter beside her. The sight stirred something deep in Nora's chest, not sorrow, not envy, but a gentle recognition. She realized then that she wasn't searching for redemption anymore. She wasn't trying to prove anything to the world or to her son. She had already made peace with all of it. What she wanted now was purpose, not to serve, but to guide. She stayed for hours, helping where she could, listening more than she spoke. When she left that afternoon, Angela handed her a small thank you card signed by the residents. On the back, someone had written, "You gave us a chance to start over." The words lingered in her mind on the cab ride home. Start over. That was the phrase she had been living without realizing it. Not revenge, not escape, renewal. That evening, she sat by the window again, the city glowing beneath her. She poured herself a cup of tea instead of wine. It felt more fitting for the moment. She picked up the phone, scrolling past Ken's number, not with anger, just certainty. He had his journey now, and she had hers. Love, she realized, didn't always mean reunion. Sometimes it meant letting people find their own way without you. She took a slow sip, then smiled to herself. "He'll be fine," she said softly. "He'll learn." Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far away. Rain began to fall again, washing the streets clean, the sound steady and reassuring. For the first time in decades, Nora didn't feel like she was waiting for life to begin. She was already in it, right here, right now, living the quiet kind of happiness that no one had ever thought she deserved. She turned off the lights, leaving only the glow from the city through her window. Before heading to bed, she whispered a final thought into the dark, a truth that no longer needed to be kept secret. "I didn't lose my family, I just stopped belonging to the wrong one." Summer bled into autumn, and with it came a rhythm that felt almost musical. Nora's days were no longer a countdown to anything. They were simply hers, unrushed, unclaimed, quiet in the way freedom often is. Every morning began the same, sunlight pooling across her hardwood floor, a kettle hissing, the faint hum of the city below. The world went on, but this time it didn't drag her with it. Her apartment had changed. The walls were lined with paintings now her own. Not masterpieces, but fragments of emotion. a cracked teacup, a closed door, an open sky. Each one carried a piece of her story, brushstrokes where apologies used to be. Her art teacher had convinced her to display them in a small neighborhood gallery. To her surprise, people connected with them. One woman even cried, saying, "It looks like learning to breathe again." Nora smiled and said, "That's exactly what it is." Her new circle of friends, artists, widows, retirees, met every Thursday at a cafe on 3rd Street. They talked about books, memory, aging, and occasionally about the strange way the world expects women to disappear after 50. "We've become ghosts who learned how to haunt gently," one of them joked. Nora laughed harder than she'd laughed in years. She had money now, more than she'd ever imagined having. But it wasn't about the wealth. It was about agency, the ability to choose, to say yes or no, to walk away without guilt. Her donations had grown into something tangible: a scholarship fund for single mothers, art programs for women starting over, a financial literacy class in her father's old office building. People began to recognize her name, not as Ken's mother, but as Nora Baker, the woman who gave second chances. One morning, as she was preparing for an art class, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it, then answered. "Mrs. Baker?" a woman's voice said softly. "This is Angela, from the shelter." "Oh, Angela, how are things?" "Better than ever," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just thought you should know one of the women you met here, Jamie. She just got hired, full-time. She said to tell you, tell Mrs. Baker she saved my life." Nora's throat tightened. For a moment she couldn't speak. Finally she managed, "No, dear, she saved her own life. I just reminded her she could." After the call, she sat for a long while, watching the city beyond her window. The skyline shimmered in the distance, and she thought about how strange life was, how losing everything had led her here, to peace, to meaning, to herself. She thought again of Ken. A few months ago, she'd received a short letter from him, handwritten, careful. "I'm working again. Small job. Apartment's modest, but I'm managing. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I just wanted you to know I'm trying." There was no plea, no manipulation, just honesty. She had smiled reading it, then tucked it into her notebook next to her letter to her younger self. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was growth, and that was enough. That evening, Nora walked to the balcony with a glass of tea and watched the city exhale into night. She thought of all the women like her women who'd been told to give until there was nothing left, who had mistaken exhaustion for virtue. She wanted to reach through the dark and tell them, "You don't have to wait for permission to live." Her phone buzzed again, a text from one of her new friends. "Dinner tomorrow? We're celebrating your gallery opening." Nora smiled and typed back, "Wouldn't miss it for the world." She looked once more at the horizon, the orange fading into deep blue, the lights flickering like quiet applause. Maybe this was what freedom really was. Not revenge, not triumph, but peace without apology. She whispered to the wind, not as a curse but as a benediction. "We don't owe anyone our silence anymore." Then she turned back inside, closing the balcony door behind her, ready to paint again, ready to keep living, not as someone's mother or someone's mistake, but as the woman she was always meant to become. The gallery night arrived on a Friday. The air outside was crisp, the city humming with that small sense of anticipation that comes before something quietly important. Nora arrived early, wearing a simple black dress and a small silver brooch, the same one she'd worn to Ken's college graduation decades ago. She smiled at the memory, not in sadness, but in recognition of how far she'd come since then. The gallery wasn't large, but every wall glowed with soft light and muted color. Her paintings hung in gentle sequence. Still water, the quiet room, after the door closed. Each piece carried a different emotion: solitude, clarity, rebirth. People stopped to study them, not because of technique, but because they felt something familiar. A woman with gray streaks in her hair whispered to her friend, "It looks like starting over." When someone introduced her to a reporter from a local magazine, he asked, "Mrs. Baker, what inspired your collection?" She answered simply, "Leaving." He blinked. "Leaving?" She nodded. Sometimes walking away is the most honest kind of art. The evening flowed easily. Her friends from the cafe came, laughing, clinking glasses, telling stories too personal to repeat. A few of the women from the shelter showed up too, dressed in borrowed dresses and shining with pride. Angela hugged her and whispered, "You're helping more people than you realize." For once, Nora didn't deflect the compliment. "Maybe," she said, smiling softly, "but I think they're helping me more." Halfway through the night, as she stood near one of her larger canvases, a hazy landscape, painted in shades of amber and gray, she noticed someone standing just outside the doorway. Ken. He looked uncertain, holding his hands awkwardly in his pockets. He wasn't wearing a suit, just jeans and a worn jacket. For a moment, neither moved. Then he stepped inside. "Hi," he said quietly. She nodded once. "Hi, Ken." He looked around the gallery, taking in the paintings. "You did all these?" "Yes. They're incredible. Thank you." A silence followed, not the hostile kind, but the delicate kind that comes when both people are afraid to ruin something fragile. "I saw the article about your donation," he said after a moment. "You're helping a lot of people." "I'm just giving what I wish I'd had," she replied. He nodded, eyes dropping to the floor. "I've been going to counseling, trying to work on things. I realized I spent my whole life expecting you to clean up after me. I thought that's what love meant." She studied him quietly. He wasn't performing. His voice was raw, almost boyish. "And what does love mean now?" she asked. He met her eyes, taking responsibility, showing up without expecting reward. For the first time, she saw a trace of the man he could have been all along. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote you something," he said, handing it to her. "You don't have to read it now." "I will," she said. He took a slow breath. "I know we can't go back. I don't even want to. I just wanted you to know I'm proud of you." Her lips curved in a small, sincere smile. "That's funny," she said, "because I'm finally proud of myself too." He laughed softly. "Then I guess we're both late to the party." For a brief second, their eyes met, not as mother and son, not as victim and betrayer, but as two flawed people standing in the same room, both learning how to live honestly. When he left a few minutes later, he didn't ask for money or forgiveness. He just squeezed her hand and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on yourself." After he was gone, Nora unfolded the paper. It was a letter, short and plain. "Mom, you were right. I didn't know what love was. But I think I'm learning. Thank you for showing me what strength looks like, not loud, not angry, just certain. I don't expect anything from you, but I wanted to tell you I'm grateful. I hope one day I can be someone my kids respect, even when I'm not useful anymore. Love, Ken." Her eyes blurred for a moment. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her purse. It didn't change the past, but it closed the wound. Later that night, as the gallery emptied and the lights dimmed, she stood alone before after the door closed. The painting glowed under the last spotlight, an image of a sunrise breaking over a horizon line. She whispered to herself, "I didn't close it to end something. I closed it so I could begin." And for the first time in her life, she knew that was entirely true. The next morning, the city was still half asleep when Nora woke. The afterglow of the gallery lingered like the warmth of a fire that hadn't gone out. She brewed her coffee slowly, the way she liked it now, strong, unhurried, black. The newspaper on her doorstep had her name on the second page. Local artist and philanthropist Nora Baker inspires women to rebuild their lives. The photo showed her standing beside her painting, smiling softly. She looked at it for a long moment, then folded the paper neatly and set it aside. That smile wasn't the public one she'd used for decades to survive dinner tables and boardrooms. It was real, earned. After breakfast, she went for her usual walk along the river. The trees were turning, their leaves a riot of copper and gold. The air had that smell of change, of things ending beautifully. She paused on the bridge, watching the water move beneath her feet. Somewhere in its rhythm, she heard the same quiet lesson life had been whispering to her all year. You can start again without starting over. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Angela at the shelter. The new scholarship program has its first graduate. Her name's Celia. She's been accepted into nursing school. She wanted me to tell you she's dedicating it to the woman who showed me that endings can be beginnings. Nora smiled. That phrase stayed with her as she walked home. Endings can be beginnings. Maybe that was the truest thing she'd ever learned. Back at her apartment, the afternoon light filtered through the curtains, turning everything gold. She sat at her desk and opened her notebook one last time. The same notebook that once carried words like, "No more waiting," and later, "Freedom earned." On the final page, she began to write, "If anyone ever reads this, I want them to know something simple. You are allowed to walk away from people who make you small. You are allowed to stop explaining yourself to those who refuse to listen. And you are allowed to build a life that doesn't require anyone's permission to exist. There is no age limit on freedom. It begins the moment you decide you deserve peace." She closed the notebook and placed it in the top drawer, next to her father's old brooch and Ken's letter. 3 lives, 3 generations, 3 different ways of learning what love costs and what dignity returns. That evening, she poured a small glass of wine and stepped out onto the balcony. The skyline shimmered like memory, steady and alive. Somewhere below, a street musician played a slow tune on a saxophone, the sound drifting upward like smoke. She leaned on the railing, letting the music and the wind wash over her. For the first time, there was no guilt, no need to be anyone else's anchor. She had been a mother, a widow, a worker, a servant of expectations. Now she was simply Nora, a woman who had stopped apologizing for being free. A knock came at the door. It was one of her neighbors, a young woman who'd moved in a few weeks ago. "Sorry to bother you," she said, smiling shyly. "I heard you're an artist. I'm struggling with a piece I'm painting for school. Would you mind looking at it sometime?" Nora laughed softly, surprised by the request. "Of course," she said. "Bring it by tomorrow." When the girl left, Nora turned back to the night sky. The city lights flickered, but for once, they didn't feel distant. They felt connected, tiny sparks of stories still unfolding. She raised her glass slightly, as if to toast them all. "To the ones who found their voice," she said quietly. "And to the ones still searching." The wind carried her words away. Somewhere below, the music changed, still soft, still steady, the sound of life moving forward. And as she stood there, bathed in the glow of a city that no longer frightened her, Nora Baker realized something profound. She hadn't been abandoned. She'd been delivered to herself. A year later, Nora's story had rippled far beyond her quiet apartment in the city. The gallery exhibition had turned into a traveling showcase, The Art of Leaving. It wasn't just about her paintings anymore. It was about resilience, about women who had rebuilt themselves after being erased. Every stop brought new faces, new letters, new stories whispered to her at the end of each event. "I left too," one woman said in Chicago. "Your story gave me the courage. My mother watched your interview," another confessed in Denver. "She finally called me after 5 years of silence." Nora listened to all of them, never pretending to have answers. She just smiled and said, "You already did the hardest part. You stopped waiting for permission." At each exhibition, she donated half the proceeds to shelters and education programs. Her name began appearing in magazines, not as an artist or benefactor, but as a quiet revolutionary, a woman who turned exile into liberation. One autumn morning, she received a letter in a plain white envelope. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. She recognized it instantly. "Mom, it's been a year. I've been working at a nonprofit that helps older adults find housing. It's not glamorous, but it feels right. I'm still in therapy. I'm still learning. The kids and I talk every weekend. I tell them about you, how strong you are. I don't ask for anything, but if you ever want to meet them again, they'd love to see you. No expectations, just love. Ken." She read it twice, then set it down beside her coffee. For a moment, she didn't move. The sunlight poured across the table, catching the edge of her cup, scattering light like a signal. After a long while, she smiled. "Maybe someday," she whispered, "but not yet." That afternoon, she met Angela for lunch. They sat outside the same cafe where everything had once begun the day Nora had first picked up a paintbrush. Between bites of salad, Angela said, "You know, you've become kind of a legend around here." Nora laughed. "A legend? For what, finally learning to say no?" Angela smiled. "Exactly that." The two women talked for hours about life, time, and the strange mercy of starting over in your 60s. When they parted, Angela hugged her tightly. "You changed more than just your life," she said. "You gave the rest of us permission to live ours." That night, back at home, Nora stood by the window again, city lights glittering below. She thought of her father's advice, the one she had ignored for most of her life. Keep something that's yours. A secret, a dream, a plan. Don't give it all away. For years, she thought he'd meant money. Now she understood he'd meant self. She turned on a small lamp, opened her black notebook, and wrote her final entry. If someone ever tells you you're too old to begin again, smile. Because they don't know that freedom isn't a door you open once it's the courage to keep walking through it, again and again, no matter who tries to close it behind you. When she put the pen down, she felt a calm that went deeper than pride. It was completion. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat quietly, watching the city breathe. Somewhere below, a car horn sounded, a baby cried, someone laughed. The world kept moving, just as it always had. But this time, she wasn't chasing it. She was simply part of it still, steady, content. A single painting rested on her easel. It wasn't finished yet, but she knew its title, Homecoming. Not a place, not a person, a state of being. She smiled, lifted her brush, and began to paint. The exhibition in New York marked the quiet peak of Nora Baker's second life. The crowd wasn't large, but it was full of faces that mattered. Students, mothers, retirees, even a few men who'd come because their wives had dragged them along, and then stayed because the story reached them too. The title banner read, Homecoming Paintings by Nora Baker. After the speeches and the polite applause faded, she slipped out a side door, onto the museum terrace. Below her, Manhattan pulsed sirens, taxis, laughter. Above her, a wash of early winter stars. She felt no need to post photos, no urge to prove anything. The act of being there, on her own terms, was enough. Her phone buzzed, a text from Ken. We're in town. The kids want to see the show. No pressure, Mom. She typed back only 2 words. I'd like that. An hour later they arrived. The grandchildren ran to her without hesitation, their joy clean and uncomplicated. Ken stood behind them, watching, waiting for permission. She gave a small nod. That was all it took. They walked the gallery together, stopping before the last canvas, the one still wet at the edges. A horizon painted in soft yellows, a single figure walking toward the light. The label beneath it read, For all who begin again. Ken whispered, It's beautiful. She smiled. It's honest. When the evening ended, they stood on the steps outside the museum. The city wind tugged at her hair. The lights painted everyone in gold. Come for dinner tomorrow, she said quietly. Bring the kids. Ken's eyes filled, and he nodded. No grand apology, no melodrama, just agreement, human and simple. That night, back in her hotel room, Nora sat by the window with a notebook on her lap. She wrote, Freedom is not revenge. It's the refusal to live smaller than you are. Love, when it returns, should meet you standing, not kneeling. She closed the book, placed it beside her bed, and turned off the light. Outside, the city kept breathing. Inside, a woman who had once been forgotten slept without fear of being needed. A year later, the apartment was quiet again, but not empty. Paintings leaned against the walls, some finished, some still waiting. The table held fresh lilies, and in the corner by the window, sunlight poured in across a half-open notebook. Nora stood by the balcony, a mug of coffee in her hands, watching the city shift from dawn to day. It had been 2 years since that morning in the senior home lobby, since Emily's cold words, since the silence that ended one life and began another. She thought of that moment now with an almost tender clarity. Back then, she believed it was exile, but now she knew it had been an awakening disguised as abandonment. On the wall hung her final painting, the title, The Window. A single open frame, light pouring through, the edges blurred like breath on glass. It wasn't grand or dramatic, just quiet, honest, the way she wanted to be remembered. The world had continued to find her story. Articles called her the patron saint of second chances. The shelter she'd funded was expanding, the scholarship program doubling its recipients. Young women wrote to her weekly letters filled with hope, anger, gratitude. Many of them began the same way. I thought it was too late for me, until I heard about you. Nora never thought of herself as a savior. She was simply a woman who'd finally told the truth out loud, that love without respect is captivity, and duty without joy is just another kind of cage. A soft knock came at the door. It was her granddaughter, Lily, holding a sketchbook. Grandma, can you show me how to paint clouds? Nora smiled. Of course. They sat together by the window, brushes ready, light spilling over their hands. "Do they ever look perfect?" Lily asked, squinting at the sky. "No," Nora said gently. "And that's what makes them real." For a while, they painted in silence. Outside, the wind moved through the city, and the sound was soft like pages turning. Later, when Lily packed her things to leave, Nora walked her to the door. "Grandma," she said, "Dad told me you're brave." Nora laughed softly. "Your dad learned that word the hard way. Will I be brave too?" "You already are." When the elevator doors closed, Nora returned to her chair by the window. She took one last look at her painting, then set her brush down for good. The work was finished. The woman who'd once been discarded had become the author of her own story. She opened the balcony door, letting the cool air wash through the room. Below, the city pulsed with life, unpredictable, beautiful, indifferent. She raised her cup one last time, a quiet toast to no one and everyone. "To those who choose themselves," she whispered, and as she stood there, light spilling across her face, the camera would have pulled back past the window, past the skyline, past the noise to a final image of peace, a woman no longer waiting for permission, framed in her own freedom.